Welcome to Myth as a Verb with Greg Salyer. In the previous lecture, we saw that myth is not only a story, it's also the story behind the story, the deeper layer of belief that is expressed in myriad stories. This week, we explore what a myth does, which is another way of asking how myth acts in the world and changes it, or more accurately, changes us. The answer is that myths, both the story behind the stories and the stories themselves, serve a number of important cultural and personal functions. In short, myths tell us how the world works and how to live in it. Why should we need to know how to live? The answer is because we are born ignorant of and vulnerable to the world. So in order to survive, we must understand our existential situation and navigate our way through the physical and social aspects of life. Instincts take us only so far because, unlike other animals, we are conscious of our vulnerabilities, including the fact that we will die. Consciousness is both a blessing and a curse, and makes us both special and especially needy. These needs, which are both physical and educational, are met by our parents and our social institutions during the transition from birth to adulthood, and ideally at least, we exist in a protected space for that period. In Western culture, education comes from all kinds of sources. In Daniel Quinn's Ishmael, it is described as being, quote, assembled from the table talk of your parents, from cartoons you watched on television, from Sunday school lessons, from your textbooks and teachers, from news broadcasts, from movies, novels, sermons, plays, newspapers, and all the rest, unquote. Childhood, then, is a time that is ripe for absorbing such mythic material, and we draw upon this period well into adulthood. There is a point, however, when parental protection and cultural tutelage must give way to self-reliance and self-actualization. This transition is often traumatic as children leave the nest to apply their learning in the larger world. Much anxiety on the part of the parents and much anticipation on the part of the child attend this moment of passage because it is a test of the teaching and learning that has taken place, and failure can be very dangerous. Sometimes it is also a test of the myths themselves, and if they fail, we must find new ones to survive. If the myths succeed, however, then the individual has a map for meaning and can adapt to the mythic material for nearly every life event. Even with the best teaching, the knowledge we bring to the world as adults is varied and incomplete because the world is so vast and complex. While it may at first glance appear that there are no myths in this assemblage, the opposite is in fact the case. The verbal tools we employ to live in the world are almost always made of mythic material and can be traced back to teachings that have been passed down through several channels, sometimes over long periods of time. As we saw in last week's lecture, these tools come in the form of stories in oral cultures because story is the primary carrier of information in that environment. The web of stories in an oral culture, while constantly evolving, is woven tighter and generally relates more clearly to cultural values. As such, myth is more apparent and its function more evident than in literate cultures. In literate cultures, however, the instructions are diffused across available media, and they appear in books, films, songs, television, and other genres. Therefore, it can be more difficult to see mythic material in a literate culture, and it often appears in fragmented form at best and seems missing altogether at worst. In fact, there is an entire literary movement called modernism that imaginatively addresses the difficulty of assembling these pieces of meaning when they are scattered across a culture. The poet T.S. Eliot famously wrote The Wasteland in this very spirit. Listen as his narrator depicts the disorientation resulting from an apparent loss of myth. "What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down so. What shall we do tomorrow? Whatever shall we do?" These are the questions and urgency of a man without myth, a man who is paralyzed by indecision and yet must keep making decisions. After a long and dense journey through an unreal landscape, Eliot's narrator concludes, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." While not everyone is a modernist, those living in literate cultures may themselves feel as if they are working with only fragments and living in ruins. Again, as Ishmael notes in Quinn's novel, "Mother Culture, whose voice has been in your ear since the day of your birth, has given you an explanation of how things came to be this way. You know it well. Everyone in your culture knows it well. But this explanation wasn't given to you all at once. No one ever sat you down and said, 'Here is how things came to be this way, beginning 10 or 15 billion years ago, right up to the present.'" Knowing something well without having it given to you all at once can be a fascinating and frustrating existence, and the student in Quinn's novel experiences these emotions frequently as he attempts to hear Mother Culture's full story, her myth. For some theorists of myth, that story is always there, a faint humming in the background, like a song that you think you know, but cannot quite place. Joseph Campbell was one of those theorists. In fact, some have argued that he is the only one who has understood myth in its deepest and most profound sense. While others have claimed that Campbell went far beyond his role of scholar and was overlaying personal beliefs upon his theory. Regardless of how Campbell has been received, there is little argument that his 4 functions of myth aptly depict what myth does. Let's look at each of the functions in turn to see how myth is a verb as well as a noun. They are the mystical, the cosmological, the sociological, and the psychological. The mystical function. Quote, "Traditionally, the first function of a living mythology is to reconcile consciousness to the preconditions of its own existence, that is to say, to the nature of life." Unquote. Myth's first action, appropriately enough, is to enable us to understand our existential situation, namely that we are ignorant of much of the world, vulnerable to many dangers, and ultimately will die. Moreover, as Campbell notes, life lives on life, and there is nothing more fundamental about life's nature than it is dependent on death. The first function of myth is to help us understand and embrace that profound relationship. The cosmological function. Quote, "The second function of mythology is to present an image of the cosmos, an image of the universe round about that will maintain and elicit this experience of awe, or to present an image of the cosmos that will maintain your sense of mystical awe and explain everything that you come into contact with in the universe around you." Unquote. Myth shows us our place in the universe. We are on the third rock from the sun, rotating and revolving fairly regularly, but not indefinitely, and part of a larger universe whose edges we have not seen or adequately imagined. Religion used to provide the second function, but it has now been largely supplanted by science, as is evident in the explanation used here. Campbell's favorite image was a photograph of the Earth taken from the moon because he thought the solid blue globe with no borders or divisions could give birth to a new transcendent mythology exercising this second function. The sociological function. Quote, "The third function of a mythological order is to validate and maintain a certain sociological system, a shared set of rights and wrongs, proprieties or improprieties, on which your particular social unit depends for its existence." Unquote. Myth does not exist apart from a culture. The third function recognizes that myth is the vehicle for initiating an individual into that culture. Therefore, myth is invested in a particular set of values found in a particular place. Living myth is never abstract or theoretical, but always enacted at some level. The psychological function. Quote, "The fourth function of myth is psychological, that myth must carry the individual through the stages of his life, from birth through maturity, through senility to death. The mythology must do so in accord with the social order of his group, the cosmos as understood by his group, and the monstrous mystery." Unquote. In addition to engaging one another in the social order, individuals also live their unique lives within their own physical, emotional, and mental spheres. Myth functions on this level as a guide, just as it does on the cultural level and in relation to it. It is an inner map for self-actualization and fulfillment. Go back and review the Learning How to Live section of this lecture. Did you hear a faint humming in the background? Something familiar that you could not quite put your finger on? That story, our story, of being ignorant and vulnerable is one we know in one form, but perhaps not in another. That period of nurturing is almost always foundational in our lives, and if we are lucky to have happy childhoods, then we remember that bliss of being ignorant of our vulnerability and even ignorant of our ignorance. Our infancy was a time when we did not know the divisions of the world and its attendant dangers and pain, but that time did not last. Eventually, we became conscious of the first cosmological function, that life is dependent upon death, that work is hard, that answers are sometimes missing or are unclear, and that ultimately we will die. Now do you know the story? Consider infancy a sojourn in a garden where every need was met with abundant provision, where you could be naked and not ashamed, where divisions like good and evil were unknown, and where death was non-existent. It was an ideal place, but you cannot live there anymore. For one reason or another, some serpent may be involved, you partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and are blocked from the tree of life. Your eyes were opened, and you became conscious of good and evil, naked and clothed, man and woman, and life and death. You must work for your food. Women must experience pain in childbirth, and you must return to the dust from where you came. Also, you will really, really hate snakes. Whether or not this is your myth, there is one that is humming to you and to everyone, providing us with a sense of our situation, our place in the cosmos, our place in society, and a map for our inner journey. And even to talk about myth, as we have done here, we must do it while in the grip of a myth.